Welcome, everyone. I'm Robert Maciejko, co-founder of the INSEAD AI community. Today, we're excited to speak with Burcu, an INSEAD alum who is a partner with Egon Zehnder based in Singapore, where she leads the technology and communications and AI practices across Southeast Asia. She previously led Egon Zehnder's global telecom practice for 3 years and is a core member of the Global Technology and Communications Practice Group. Burcu focuses on senior leadership advisory and executive search in tech, telecom, digital, media, and services. She specializes also in CIO and CTO roles across all industries. She leads top-level search, management appraisal, and leadership development projects in Southeast Asia and emerging markets. She previously held executive roles at Dell and Procter & Gamble and has a degree from Bicakci and, of course, INSEAD. Plus, we're joined by Christoph Wollersheim, who supports clients from Washington, D.C. He's a member of Egon Zehnder's services practice and artificial intelligence practice, where he is published. He leverages extensive personal experience in AI, data analytics, and executive leadership with roles at Nobilis, Arcadis, McKinsey, Booz Allen Hamilton, and MIT. Christoph is passionate about helping companies improve their AI maturity by assembling top leadership teams. He has a proven track record in leading teams personally, driving cultural shifts to attract and retain AI talent. He has managed himself teams of 12 to over 200 staff and held P&L responsibility for annual revenues up to 60 million, so a practitioner. Christoph holds degrees from Cologne and Münster. Both our dear guests are dedicated to building the next generation of AI leaders, and that's what we're here today to talk about. I'll point first towards Christoph about AI trends, challenges, and opportunities. What are the most significant AI-related challenges and opportunities for companies and AI leaders today? How can they navigate possible pitfalls like workforce displacement, data privacy issues, and the like?
Yeah, thanks, Robert. Thanks, Fabio, and thank you to the entire community for having us here today. It's really great to be here. So I think responding to your questions about the biggest challenges that we see out there, I think many of our clients understand that the biggest risk these days around AI is the risk of doing nothing. So you need to embrace this technology, and many of our clients who are most often CTOs, CHROs, they are being tasked by their leaders, by the CEOs, by the boards of getting started, doing something about AI. And they come to us with these kinds of questions and they say, okay, where can I find the right AI leader? Where should this person sit in the organization? And what is it that we need to be aware of there, right? So ideally, we find people who can thrive in an AI era, someone who can lead and build a technical team, but someone also who can excite an organization and can make sure that pitfalls are being avoided that they might already seen in other places where they served before. So the biggest questions that we are being asked every day is, number one, where in the organization should this person sit? How elevated should this role be? Should this AI team be centralized or should it be decentralized? And at the end of the day, also, who should I hire? Or maybe find someone internally as well. And I think the role that Burcu and I have in that context is quite an exciting one because we come very early on in that process. I always say there are 3 types of consultants in that space in AI. The first group is what I call the hard hat consultants. So these are the people who do the plumbing, the piping, the drilling, the ones who build the models. So these are the Accentures, the Booz Allen Hamiltons, where I used to work at, the ones who build AI models and the technical experts. Then there's a second group of consulting firms, which are the strategy consulting firms, right? The McKinseys, the BCGs, some of them also trying to get into the hard hat consulting space with BCG X or McKinsey Quantum Black. But their core competence is to help clients with setting up a program like that so that they can generate impact, and thinking about the use cases, the use case pipeline, the prioritization, the use case factory, all these things. And then there's the third group of people, which is basically what Burcu and I are doing. We are like an executive search firm that is coming in very early on when these clients are just being faced with the question, okay, what can we do with AI? Where should this person sit? And I think the most rewarding part is that we are not just looking at like squeezing out a few millions here and there through an algorithm, but we are really finding the right leader that can generate tens and hundreds of millions of impact for large organizations. That's quite exciting there. And you also asked about the workforce. I think everyone has an opinion about the workforce and how it will evolve, including Elon Musk. I personally believe that the future of the workforce will be a transformation from a pyramid where we are right now in many organizations towards a rectangle. So basically mean by that, like that, we see a lot of lower skilled jobs in many organizations. And I think AI will move towards like shaping off or cutting off these edges of the pyramid at the bottom and are moving them upwards. So it becomes like more of a rectangle. And I think the challenge that many HR professionals have these days is to think about that transformation of the workforce and how can you move these places of the pyramid up to become, so that people can become managers of people, but also managers of bots eventually.
That gives a very nice overview of the landscape in which you're working, Christoph. Thank you. What about preparing for AI disruption? How can organizations prepare their leadership and workforce for disruptive changes brought by AI? What steps can they take to ensure a smooth transition and maximize benefits?
I think everyone in an organization, especially the leadership teams, should know something about AI, right? So they shouldn't know all the nuts and bolts of all the models that they are working on, but they should have some basic understanding of what the organization is doing in that space. And they should also have like maybe a basic understanding of what's the art of the possible. So in one of my previous roles, I worked for Arcadis as a global head for data analytics and insights, and I was responsible for these kinds of topics as well. What we did is we had an AI awareness training for board members and for the ELT members, where we just sat together on a couple of hours every week and just talked about what's possible with AI. We also developed an AI translator training for many people in the organization, because you want to have ambassadors in all kinds of different business units, people who can ideate use cases with the business units, who know the business very well, and can think about where AI can automate and can maybe even generate new revenues there. And a great way to do all of that, use case ideation workshops, where you just bring together people and you start like thinking about, okay, where can we apply, I don't know, computer vision in our business? Where can we apply an LLM in our business? And that just like, number one is fun, because you come together with a diverse set of backgrounds. But number two, also, sometimes there are really great ideas that are coming out of these kinds of workshops. It can be quite useful. And then these translator trainings, McKinsey talks a lot about those. They are a great way to create these cohorts and advocates and multipliers across the entire business. And you want to have as many as possible of those.
Yeah, it's clear that you bring a very practical view to AI and how to change organizations. What about evolving roles? How do you see the roles, responsibilities of AI leaders evolving in next years? 5-10 is way out. But what new roles or specializations do you anticipate in AI leadership? Could there be like AI ethics officers, AI strategy directors?
I think that's a good question. It's probably a difficult question to answer. As a data scientist, I would probably look a little bit like back 10, 15 years back and try to extrapolate from what I've seen there. And what I've seen is that over the last 10 years or so, 10, 15 years or so, we've moved from developing the foundation for AI towards leading AI, towards executing and also controlling and AI, right? So we started with the more foundational capabilities around data, right? So getting the data in order, making sure that we get the data pipeline, making sure that we have the data governance in place. And all of that was under the purview of the chief data officer 10, 15 years ago. that moved then to the chief analytics officer, often combined into chief data and analytics officer roles, where we were also starting to think about what's possible with the data that we bring together. And now everything is about AI, and it has evolved about into the chief AI officer, where the focus is less on getting the foundation right, but the focus is much more on what is the art of the possible, right? So how can we apply AI in our business? And that kind of trend is an interesting one, and I think will probably continue like that for a while. We also see that there's an elevation of these roles, right? So it used to be very much embedded somewhere in the tech organization or the IT organization. Maybe you had a director for data, maybe you had a manager for data governance or something like that. But this has now evolved and has been elevated into sometimes even direct reports to the CEO. And then when it comes to your other question was like, what was the substructure to that? So oftentimes CAIOs now are looking into, I don't know, director or VP level reports. They're looking into ethical AI, making sure that the organization is stood up there from a safe perspective. They are looking into AI strategy and have someone responsible for that. And I had in my program also someone being responsible for AI culture and AI trainings and so on. So I think all of that could continue in my mind.
So there might be a lot of opportunities for INSEAD type people. So Burcu, that brings us to the next question about identifying AI leaders. And what about key qualities? What are specific qualities, competencies that are essential for AI leadership? How do you prioritize them? What attributes should an ideal candidate possess? And maybe you could talk here about your archetype work about AI leaders.
Thanks, Robert. And I think starting from the archetypes discussion is a good way to answer this question. And what we mean by archetypes is maybe putting a bit of a framework on what kind of AI leaders we're talking about out there. So we have looked into the space quite extensively since we started focusing the AI work, which is now almost 2 years ago. And we have made a classification of 3 major archetypes. So for us, the first one is really the shapers of the industry. And this is like most of the celebrities, as we would know, right? Sam Altmans of this world, or the policymakers, not only the technical people, it's also whoever is really looking into what does it mean for a country's policies, or what does it mean for human, what does it mean for society, what does it mean for workforce. So really trying to shape up how the future is going to look like with AI, as well as building what we know as the big Gen AI wave, or even the AI related previous waves of predictive models and machine learning and all that, right? So most of the celebrities would fall into that camp, and it's a very niche market. And generally, these people are very driven with a mission. They're extremely passionate about shaping up the world with this. The second group of people we would call as AI builders. These people would be either in the form of like chief scientists in organizations, or they might be also what we call like technical gurus. And the difference between a chief scientist and a technical guru is more related to, one is quite inventing for inventing, while the technical guru is inventing for a particular use case. So a bit of closer use case attribution of the work, while the chief scientist is there looking for, let me try to build this and let's see what comes out of it. And it's mostly funded and quite backed with deep pockets and deep investors of the field. And they would work with the most brainy engineers in the world. And they would also be sitting in an ivory tower, not really too much integrating with the complexities of a corporate world. While the technical guru kind of people are more to the ground, right? So they would be the ones that we see in the big tech AI builders of today. So they would still be quite aware of the corporate dynamics. They would manage teams. They would have what we call the leadership qualities of managing, and also attributing their work to what we call as a business case attribution. And then the third major group we're talking about is like AI transformers and executors, which is the bulk of the talent that we generally deal with between Christoph, me, and like Egon Zehnder kind of people, because the first 2 groups, which is AI industry shapers and the like builders are this very niche and very small group of people. And then there is a chunk of people who brings all of that to the use cases, all of that to the markets. And when it comes to the AI transformers, we also look into them as technology-driven ones and business-driven ones, because we also see in organizations there are many technology-driven CTO-based AI talent, while we also see a lot of business-driven, insights-driven AI talent in the organizations. So these are like the three mega types that we can focus on. And coming back to your question, Robert, you were talking about what characteristics would typify these. Leaving aside the shapers, which is actually the like top of the pyramid, maybe starting from the builder side, which is the technology, like technical gurus, chief scientists. There we're really looking at academic pedigrees, PhDs, like brainy people out there, and really investing time and energy to transformative technologies. And generally these people are characterized with a career of lifelong mathematicians, statisticians, and really getting PhDs into building these models, and they're quite technically driven. On the technical guru type, we're still looking for a little bit of those leadership qualities, at least from an organization management perspective, teams management perspective. But as I said, most of our focus is on the AI transformers and executors. And let me tell you, that is where actually the bulk of the INSEAD population, as well as people like us, are spending our time. So what matters there is, first of all, the most important thing is like really understanding the business that you're solving for, because anything that's being done in that pool of talent is solving for a business need and creating value for your business people. So be it a technology person, be it a business person, being technology savvy as well as business savvy is a very important skill that we can't compromise from. The other thing is entrepreneurship or intrapreneurship. So what we mean by that is, if you think about the leader in a big company even, starting by asking for millions of dollars into the field doesn't work. So people need to comply with limited resources and like start collecting low-hanging fruits and showing the value before going and trying to do something big and bringing big consultants and big projects and transformations in-house. So it's entrepreneurship within a company, or also building a company as an entrepreneur also matters a lot. Engagement and communication is another quality that we're really very keen on, because it requires a lot of convincing. It requires a lot of, you need to get in and get into a management team and consider buy-in from many people for getting that investment and getting the approval. So that stakeholder management, convincing, and building a business case, these are quite important qualities that we're looking for. And maybe last but not least, transformation and change management skills are absolutely critical. Because these things don't happen in a short time. You can still be very creative and building things, but as long as you don't show the result, as long as you don't get the organization together with you, then that leadership is actually a waste of money. So these are typical qualities that we're looking for when we think about the top of the house leaders in the AI space.
So it sounds like there's opportunity for INSEAD people, even if they don't have a PhD in AI.
Clearly, I think it's a very solid yes, because first of all, INSEAD has very diverse background students, right? I'm an INSEADer. I came into INSEAD quite a techie myself and then transformed over to business. Many of my peers were similar paths. We also have a lot of consultants coming to INSEAD and then continuing as consultant careers, as well as people coming from like industry fields and then continuing their careers. I think there is a lot of leadership traits that an INSEAD kind of a person brings together, because we generally have INSEAD people are very EQ-wise quite high, internationally very versatile, they're communicative, they're extremely like having this learning agility, curiosity. These are extremely good qualities for getting into the field. If you have a bit of technology savviness from your background, of course it helps. If you have done some data and AI work, business intelligence work, or some IT work, some programming, software, coding, these are really important skills that will immediately make you very relevant. Or as well, if you've been into consulting, or if you've been into business insights-driven functions, and if you're a very analytical person, then very much, I think it's a very obvious yes to your question.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you. So industry geo-specific skills. What industry-specific skills and experiences are crucial for AI leaders? Do the requirements vary across regions in the world, Europe, Americas, Asia Pacific?
I think the requirements don't vary too much. The depth might vary a bit between regions. We still think US is far ahead in the overall progression of the talent needs and like how AI is being used in business practices. We also think China is ahead, but China is not so open in terms of talent export, talent import. So it's actually more of a closed loop itself. Other than that, I think we can actually say Asia and Europe almost par. We actually think at times Asia is a bit ahead of the game than Europe because of the adaptability and population being really young, technology being in the center of many of the countries' transformation agendas in this part of the region. Singapore is definitely a pioneer, to be honest, in terms of like how do you make this as a strategic agenda for the overall country's transformation. Although it's a very small market, I think there's a lot to learn out of Singapore when it comes to AI skills and how AI is being used to transform the country. On the industries, Robert, I think this is a key and good question because regardless from AI, in the executive search that we do, what skills are applicable to other industries is always a big question. But at the top of the house, there is always competition. And therefore, betting into potential is not a preferred option. If you don't find a great talent that's great in that industry, yes, you'll then go to the neighboring industry and then look for a talent. For example, I've seen many of the insurance players going and recruiting from banking, or fintech players going and recruiting from banking. There is, of course, some neighboring industries where there is a deep talent pool, and then you can also go and borrow from there. But generally, industry knowledge is a very big nice to have, not a must have, right? Especially if you're coming from a very traditional industry and looking for an AI kind of pioneering approach. Of course, then you're not going to be able to find it in your industry. In that case, you go to what is next. And generally, it's interesting, but in our experience, if you're a traditional company and if you go and try to recruit from the very top of the house, kind of an AI progressive company, that's generally a very DNA mismatch. Just doesn't work because the person just finds himself in a cold shower and it just doesn't stick. So we're trying to actually manage expectations a lot from that perspective.
Yeah, cultural fit must be an interesting question in these days. So that brings us to attracting and compensating AI talent. Christoph, on talent acquisition strategies, what strategies do you recommend for attracting top AI talent, given the competition for them? How can organizations foster a culture that appeals to AI professionals?
Mm-hmm. It's a good question. Thank you. I think it has evolved over time as well, right? So when I started this journey, I don't know, 15 years ago, it was impossible to find very technical people because the profession of data scientist was basically a combination of people like me who knew something about statistics because they did, I don't know, economics or were statisticians or they were mathematicians, but they didn't really know how to code as well, right? So then the other side, there were computer scientists who knew how to code, but they didn't know much about statistics. And those were basically the two pools of technical talents that you had available there 10, 15 years ago. So that was the beginning of that journey where it was impossible to find data scientists. We always said at Booz Allen, when someone has the name data scientist or the words data scientist in their resume, that's a $200,000 price tag right away. Then over the time, 5 years after that, I think it was more and more difficult to find people who were willing and able to lead teams as well. So it's not only about building your models, but it also is then interesting or that you find someone who can lead a team of data scientists, who's interested in the people side of things, who's able to communicate well, who can talk to stakeholders. And that was like the challenge, I would say like 5 or 10 years ago. And today we have the challenge of finding these AI executives that Burcu described. And I think ideally, maybe to add to Burcu's response from 2 minutes ago, ideally, you find someone who's in that sweet spot of knowing the AI capabilities that are relevant to a certain industry and who has the domain knowledge to work with the business very closely on identifying the value drivers. Because so my advice to anyone at INSEAD who's like a data scientist and wants to become like a data leader or an AI leader is to do this, to build like a technical foundation, but at the same time also focus on an industry that you are very passionate about. So if you know everything about the use cases in oil and gas, you will be the oil and gas champion in the world going forward. And there's probably only a handful or a few dozens of people who can do it at that level. If you know everything about defense, focus on defense and AI use cases in that space. If you know everything about healthcare, focus on AI and healthcare, right? So that's a little bit like the sweet spot that you want to be in, and these are the people that we are looking for in many of the searches. You also ask about like, how do you attract and retain talents? And I think it has always a little bit like been a challenge to some more traditional companies, as Burcu was alluding to, right? So if you are a very traditional company, you suddenly want to start like a data science team or an AI team. How do you make sure that people from the West Coast feel welcomed and love your culture? I always say data science is a team sport, right? So just like hiring a couple of data scientists doesn't really help you with your AI journey. You will need a very diverse set of technical backgrounds there. You will have to look for data engineers, data scientists, probably also someone who knows new business model innovation and can develop like the right apps for you, UX, UI. All these different skills are coming together, and that's what these kinds of talents are looking for as well. They are looking for an inclusive environment that has a different set of skill sets than most other traditional organizations have. And then the number one thing to think about when you're hiring these kinds of talents is that you need to give them meaningful work. I think I always joked, like when I was running my AI transformation at Arcadis, I always joked and said the best way to lose a data scientist is to hire them and give them some data visualization work to work on, letting them work on Tableau and Power BI or something like that, right? So that's the most frustrating thing. But it's also like a little bit like a chicken and egg problem here, because most often you don't necessarily have this kind of very relevant work available before you hire these kinds of talents. But yeah, so I think like meaningful work, creating like an inclusive environment that brings different skill sets together, and also making sure that the organization is open for change. That's probably also something that one should think about when you want to foster, right? When you want to create a culture that is open for AI and a transformation in that space.
Amazing. So there's a lot of cultural issues, something where INSEAD people can play a big role, certainly. What about compensation and incentives? How do compensation packages for AI leaders compare to other leadership roles? What incentives work best, and what are the trends? Are there differences across geographies?
Yeah, there are definitely differences when it comes to geographies, right? So I think in the US, compensation tends to be higher, and that's definitely one of the main things to think about there, right? So it's the region that you are in. It's probably also about the industry is a big factor there, right? So are you in a fast-growing, high-margin kind of environment, or are you in a stagnant, low-margin environment? The size of the company definitely is a factor as well. And then the elevation of the role in the organization. How much value is expected from an AI program is also relevant, right? For instance, I have an AI role for an oil and gas company that we filled just recently. And the client said, this role will create a lot of impact. It's a $60 billion company or something like that. We are not talking about like a few millions of cost savings here and there. We are talking about impacts in the billions. So a company that is expecting $1 billion impact from AI is willing to pay much more in terms of compensation than a company that is trying to squeeze a few dollars here and there. So all of that together, it's difficult to give comp ranges, but I would say if you are at the lower scale of these things that I just mentioned, you probably look at compensation levels in the US of probably starting at 700,000 and goes all the way to 1.8 million, something like that. That would be my estimate right now. The labor market for AI talents is still very hot, right? So last year was an interesting year for tech office with everything that happened there in Silicon Valley and major layoffs in spring 2023. But at the same time, we saw a lot of demand for AI leaders. So it was a difficult year for tech officers in general, but AI leaders have been picking up. These searches are in high demand, and especially in North America, I would say chief AI officer searches are very, very common these days and are keeping us very busy. It doesn't mean that it's impossible to find great chief AI officers. We definitely know many and have a good network of these people across the different industries that we are working on.
Excellent. Burcu, let's talk about putting together the whole team composition. What are the best practices you've seen for integrating AI leaders that we've been talking about with traditional C-suite positions to avoid role confusion? We've talked about CAIOs, chief AI officers, CIOs, CTOs, CAOs, CDOs. How do you manage overlap?
As you rightly said, right, they're all quite confusing, and already the definitions are very confusing from one to the other. So when we hit a need, when we talk to a client, we try to understand what they're solving for before even calling the person something. And most of the cases, we are even asking, do you need to hire, or who do you have internally, right? Because most of the cases, the answer might even be internally available. Organization might not be fertile enough from a design perspective, or the person who is there might not be given the right sponsorship for driving the AI work. So there are also cases quite often where the internal talent can be the answer to the solution. So in all of those roles that you mentioned, Robert, I think the idea is to define what am I going to do with AI and how big is it going to be, right? If it's going to be big, if it's going to be disruption, and as Christoph mentioned, if it's going to be $1 billion strategy in the coming 5 years, then of course it has to be a top role, and then everybody needs to be shaken in the leadership way. A serious shake is needed to drive that kind of value. And it's not just one person, it's definitely a team sport. And then, of course, how do you skill up the others? How do you train the others? How do you make them more open-minded is becoming an extremely important question. So we've seen examples of that where there are very determined companies who came to us and already explained, this is the way to go, and this is the money we're putting on the table, and let us understand what to do about it. And in general, for those, we also look into organizational capabilities inside, and then show them externally what's available, try to drive the strategy together, especially also seeing the overall adaptability of the organization. Because if it's a traditional leadership team full of people who are not even willing to embrace the change that's coming, it needs to start from a cultural evolution. It needs to start from even a more structural program than just hiring somebody and then putting the person into something that he can't really be successful in. Well, the other model that we have seen, and I think that's also quite a viable model, is bottom up. So instead of going top down, if you have a few sponsors up there, so if you have one or two who are very willing to embrace it kind of leaders who can sponsor some of the, let's say, mid-level or junior people in the organization, there is also a lot of momentum that can be created bottom up. So these leaders could be clever to delegate some of the work in identification of where are my jewels in this organization and where can these people create some quick wins so that I can demonstrate the value, and then this becomes part of the equation in every corner of the company. So one of my clients, and I really love sharing this, of course, I can't quote the client's name here, they have actually created a program about developing their leaders or upskilling their talent. And they opened it to every single individual in the company with a partnership with Khan Academy. So they said, look, we will have a 5-semester program, and this is just going harder and harder at every stage. And we're going to grow data scientists from this organization. So whoever is interested, sign up. we're going to be sponsoring you. And because it's an online training, because it's online qualification, it wasn't a big investment either. 5,000 people signed up out of an organization of, I don't know, it's a 50,000 something organization. Out of the 5,000, people kept dropping because the thing became harder and harder, right? So each time they were getting certified, each time they were getting like, this is too hard, I can't do it anymore. So they qualified 50 data scientists, which became an unbelievable, fantastic moment in the company. And then, of course, throughout the whole wave, they also certainly qualified certain people to a certain extent. And they also became quite part of the force as well. And that's a great example of a bottom-up movement, which is sponsored, of course, with certain budgets. And maybe it's cheaper than bringing in Egon Zehnder and McKinsey into the top-level recruitment. So there are different ways of doing that. But at the end, I think the leadership team needs to be open-minded. There should be a very big sponsorship from the CEO, for sure. If it doesn't happen from the CEO, then it doesn't fly. Even at times, from an investor shareholder perspective, there needs to be an awareness depending on the size and the governance of the company. So if the sponsorship there is there, then the tactics could be either top down or bottom up. Both examples exist.
Yeah, it's clear that you guys have quite a strategic view on these roles and also a view into the operation, how to get things to actually work. What about cross-functional collaboration? What roles or functions are critical for AI leaders to collaborate with to ensure successful AI implementation? How important is it to include people from legal, from ethical, cybersecurity experts in AI leadership teams?
You already called out most of the very critical functions, Robert. It's really important to include those ethical, legal, sustainability. Of course, business people, let's start from the first one, right? If you are an AI leader in a particular mission, your best buddy is a business leader. So what are you solving for? I come back to this question all the time. If you are solving for a marketing problem, if you are solving for a how do I increase my top line problem? Or if you're solving for a productivity problem, your best buddy is your business partner who you're going to execute with, because you're going to serve either productivity increase of a finance organization, or you're going to serve the software development organization's efficiency gain by so and so percentage. So you always have a goal in mind. And once you have that goal in mind, and then you have to think about putting a team together who are like the stakeholders, who like HR is a big stakeholder, for example. Whatever AI initiative you're getting into has an implication on either roles, role definitions, or new talent to be hired, new talent to be trained. So HR is a big counterpart. Your business person is a counterpart. Legal is a big counterpart, because then data privacy issues get into stage. Risk management, what if AI is not giving what we want, issues get into play. Corpcom at times get into play, because you want to announce that you're doing certain things through AI, and because of this, you're a pioneering company. And in general, communication is sometimes even underestimated in the AI transformation. Because if you think about it, it's interesting. When we hire top talent, or when we also look into how you attract these people at young ages who are very visionary or purpose-driven, they also look and see the communication of top leaders of a company. So it's not just your role description. It's what does the CEO's speech look like? What does the CFO's speech look like? If there is no speech, that's also a watch out, because the company needs to stand for a purpose. The company needs to call out the technology advancements as part of the strategy. So these people are very smart. Young people that these companies are trying to attract are extremely smart. They can smell it, right? Immediately. If there's no communication, that's also a smell. So communication, corpcom, like how people show up, the company's overall image, these are very important. So it's actually a partnership from all angles. I guess there's nobody in the organization from an LT perspective we can say, look, this person is totally irrelevant to AI. Not at all. Everybody needs to be in that.
Excellent. So I want to toss in two questions from the audience before we talk about upskilling. And I think you've talked about the first one a bit. What is the team of a chief AI officer made of? Do you have anything to add on that besides what you've said already?
I think these roles that I mentioned there, they are the key ones, right? So but it depends on like how broad that role is. Oftentimes you've got chief AI officers that are now also responsible for the data pipeline. So chief data and AI officers. So then you have probably someone responsible for data. So it could be a VP for data, director for data. Then another key aspect is on the business side of things, right? So how do you ideate then with the business leaders on their use case? How do you prioritize the use cases? There could be someone responsible for the AI strategy, developing that, implementing that, developing some agile methodologies to make sure that it's not just like something for the drawer, but is actually being used and implemented. And then, as I mentioned before, like an interesting role is everything around people and culture, right? Because I think that's oftentimes the one that is being overlooked by many people because they think it's a technical thing, it's run by technical people. But to be honest, the number one reason why AI programs are failing is the people component. People are not adopting AI as people thinking they do. I always give the example, when we were at McKinsey, we developed like a great tool for aircraft maintenance folks that was already collecting all the data from engines and so on coming in. And the moment the aircraft landed, the technicians were supposed to know everything about what's wrong with the airplane. But the problem is no one ever used that tool because they felt hurt in their job ethics, basically. So it's the job of a technician to find out what's wrong with the aircraft. And if you have that kind of mindset, I talked to someone on Monday who said like they now hired psychologists for the AI team to overcome these kinds of challenges. So maybe that's even another role that you could think of in an AI team, to think about the cultural aspects and how do you really drive the adoption of AI in the organization from a psychological perspective.
We also see some vague organization structures. What that means is you might have the AI people, let's say under CTO, or let's say as an independent organization, but then you would have certain functions under like more data scientists or data engineers or architects or governance. These are more the data functions. You could have them officially there, but then up there somewhere, like under the CEO, there could be a council, like an advisory council, which is not an organic hierarchical unit, but more like an advisory council composed of people like the ethics committee or like legal people or HR, like a group of executives who are passionate about making this happen, comes every now and then together and advises on matters which are not organically reporting to anything in any sort of organization. But those are also things that we see quite often, because then it's actually driven by the chief AI officer or whoever is the AI responsible person to bring that committee together and get the consent before actually moving and doing anything formally. So that's something we also see.
Let me toss in another question before going to upskilling. Who does the chief AI officer report to?
We've seen rarely CEO, more often CTO, and then also equally often distributed between a business leader and the CTO. So the roles of data governance, data engineering, data lakes, all the technology components of data is under CTO, for example, and then you would have some of the insights driving, the business driving people under the business leader, whoever is sponsoring the effort. So distributed structures also exist. So we've seen different ways.
Excellent. And I'll follow up on upskilling leaders. What training and development programs do you recommend for current leaders to become proficient in AI? Are there specific programs, certifications you find particularly valuable?
It's a tough one. Look, we're not here to advertise anything. INSEAD would be one. So look, tons. It's probably starting from a very self-generated learning journey. Seriously, when I meet HRs and when we talk about how to develop leadership skills, etc., of course, there is always a formal kind of way of training people. But in today's age, if somebody is saying, look, HR is not looking after me and giving me programs, I'm like, okay, give me a minute, right? So you have tons of resources out there. So I don't think there is anything that has to be recommended. And you can go to LinkedIn, you can go to Khan Academy, you can go to Udemy. Everything is even for free, right? You don't even need to pay anything. So for me, basic awareness starts from self-learning. And for self-learning, whoever is interested, there are tons of great podcasts, amazing podcasts coming from even those AI builders of the world, right? The AI influencers of the world. So I think most of them are very much worth to follow. I definitely suggest Mustafa Süleyman's latest book, like The Coming Wave. I definitely recommend Max Tegmark as one of the opinion leaders. Read a few books. And then if you're interested in social impact, you can actually read Power and Progress from Daron Acemoğlu. I mean, there are really tons of great resources out there. Just a couple of suggestions on self-reading. And then, of course, there are tons of paid programs as well. But are we, as a community of INSEAD people here, are we really looking for those paid programs at this stage? Probably not immediately. If you're one level up and if you're really getting into the specifics of certain things, of course, you're going to look for vendor-led programs, because these are actually most of the sponsored and particular technologies, particular platforms, particular models. And then, of course, it's vendor-driven. I really think there is no right answer to what you asked, and it's a great question. Just start from somewhere and just listen and read and discover for yourself and play with the tools. All the tools are out there. I mean, I always feel like I'm missing something because there's tons that I can't play with. And somebody is coming and saying, oh, you haven't tried that? I'm like, okay, am I missing something? That's the feel I have. I'm sure everybody's that as well. So
I think everybody feels that way. No matter how deep you are, you don't know everything. And besides the resources you mentioned, we had Ethan Malik on from Wharton. He wrote a book, Co-Intelligence, and I recommend it to everybody I know, including my family, as a very accessible but also broad resource. Now, Christoph, let's dive into board engagement and education. So what's the board's role in AI governance? How should boards of directors engage with AI governance? What specific responsibilities should they assume to ensure responsible AI and compliance, given all the regulation that we either have or rather are expecting? How can they stay ahead of emerging legal and ethical challenges?
I think it's a very valid question, because my feeling is always like that boards are a little behind there, right? So a lot of the discussion over the last 10, 20 years or so, as I mentioned before, so we started talking about the technical side, then we talked about like, how do you lead AI? But the supervision of AI was always a little bit like neglected in that discussion, right? And especially now with all these things that you mentioned in terms of new regulations and so on that are coming out there, ethical AI, responsible AI, data privacy, IP rights, right? So do we actually own the models that we are training on other people's data? All these kinds of questions should be topics that the board should be thinking about. And we actually released like a paper about that a few weeks ago, because we did some research and talked to a lot of folks in the industry. And it's interesting that the number of dedicated AI professionals on boards is still rather limited. So we don't see that many board searches dedicated for find me an AI expert. And our hypothesis is, we are still trying to test that with like additional research and more interviews, is that it's similar to the cybersecurity function as well, right? So everyone needs it, everyone knows it's extremely important, but you typically don't have like a cyber person on your board. It's part of the tech committee, right? So the tech committee is usually driving this kind of topic. But I still think that this is broader than just the tech committee. I still think every board member should ask questions around AI. And there are questions that we should all be thinking about, all board members should be thinking about, like the strategy, right? So what is our organization doing in terms of AI? Who owns that? Obstacles, pitfalls, roadblocks that we are incurring in our AI transformation. They should also think about like questions around and asking questions around responsible AI. There's a lot of risk that is associated to that, right? If you have like biased models that are influencing your business outcomes, you need to be aware of that, and you need to work against those as a board, right? So you need to ask questions around the IP that I mentioned earlier. And then the third set of questions, which is especially interesting in Europe, where you have a lot of AI-related regulations with GDPR and the new AI regulation. You just have to make sure that you are compliant as an organization there and ask questions around that as well.
Excellent. Yeah, Burcu talked a lot about education and learning. Are there any specific challenges with board members or any methods to educate board members on AI to keep them informed?
Yeah, so I think Burcu mentioned a lot of great resources in terms of self-learning, and I think all of that is also relevant for board members. So again, it doesn't need to be all the details about like how certain algorithms are stood up, but it's about what is the art of the possible from a high-level perspective, right? What's behind some of these things that we are all using every day, and what are the algorithms about, and how can you apply them to the business? The second thing is probably also that every board should be trying to stay informed about what's going on in the organization. Just invite people to present, invite the AI leader on a regular basis, and let them inform you about the latest, greatest of the program. And maybe also invite some external experts once in a while that can give you some advice, some lessons learned.
Two more questions from the audience before we come to final comments. How do you set realistic AI expectations within an organization?
Sometimes possible, sometimes not. So we try our best, right? That's the answer. We do believe we have a certain amount of calibration. We see enough cases, and therefore it's our job to be quite transparent. But you also need to remember, when we walk into a client situation, there is a dreaming kind of a person in front of us. They don't call us if they're very conservative anyways, right? They try to figure out, and they try to be like, let's wait and see, like until the others do it. So when we're called in, generally we have a very excited person who understands as much as the person can, and then has a dream about it, and then wants to create quite a dream out of all these fantasies. And if you say, look, this is too early, or you're not there yet, that would just not be possible. There needs to be a better way, or a better language to talk about. So we are trying to normalize those expectations as much as we can. We are actually, tactics are by asking questions, right? What have you been doing so far? So what does your organization look like? So what has been your journey so far? Do you have, if somebody doesn't even have data so far in the organization, the only thing they can do is actually using those ready-made Gen AI kind of tools, which actually is the reason why this thing has just become extremely popular, because Gen AI doesn't require you to have big data lakes, big data, whatever, right? It's just creating things out of available public information, and that's the reason why it has become so big. So if somebody has a disruption idea, like becoming competitive out of AI, that requires much more investment than just using a simple Gen AI use case. Therefore, we're trying to understand how much thinking has gone to that kind of field. And sometimes we're actually coming up with proposals of consulting projects rather than an executive search project, because most of these immature dreamers would come and ask us to find the most brilliant AI leader on the world and hire for their organization, although there is no base work, groundwork so far. So we might sometimes try to convince these people, saying, look, let us have a look into your organization. Let us help you with strategizing the talent a little bit and help you understand what would fit best. So those are tactics that we are using. And sometimes that just fires back, and then they might call a competitor of ours for the work that we don't do. And then sometimes they just think, oh, these guys are realistic, so let me listen to that. So that's my experience, and I'm also willing to hear Christoph's experience, but that's what I'm seeing on a day-to-day basis.
I think that the spirit of the question was more about how you suggest leaders to set realistic expectations than how Egon Zehnder set realistic expectations.
If I can add to what Burcu just mentioned, I think the key misalignments are probably around two aspects. The first one is timeline, and the second one is budgets, right? So where the candidates are always trying to maximize budget and scope, and the organizations are always trying to shrink the timeline and see the impact as soon as possible. And I think that can lead to issues if you think about that some of your Horizon 3 innovations oftentimes require some time, and buying that time, it's sometimes some negotiations between the board, the CEO, and the AI leaders that have to happen there. And we come in there very early on as well to set these kinds of expectations in the right way so that we can attract the right talents.
Mhm. So I'm coming to the final question, and I'm going to put it together with a question from the audience. So do you have any final thoughts to share? What should listeners remember most or urgently do regarding AI leadership? And I'll put that together with this question. What advice would you give to someone with wide business experience, solid understanding of data science tools, so they can stand out as a business-driven AI transformer? So how do the listeners move on and be successful and position themselves?
Maybe I start, Burcu. I think we talked a lot about risks today and managing risks, but I think we should also think about the opportunities that AI provides, not only to us, but also to our organizations that we are all serving. Just in Burcu's in my profession, I think LLMs have transformed things quite a lot with like text summarization, text creation. And I think the risks that people see there are sometimes overstated and the opportunities sometimes overlooked. And we all probably have to think about the opportunities. We all have to think about like how AI can make our lives easier so that we can get freed up for more meaningful work, for more interesting work, for more creative work. And my advice in terms of how do you best position yourself going forward is what I mentioned earlier as well, right? So you think about like how AI can help you in your domain that you are an expert in, right? So if you know everything about healthcare and something about AI, and you combine these two capabilities together, you are unbeatable, right? So you will be the one of the few experts in the world that can really make sense of generating impact through AI in healthcare. And I think that's a little bit like my advice, right? So just be creative, think about the ways that AI can help you in your daily routines.
So let me add just whatever hasn't been said, and I fully subscribe to what Christoph is saying. One thing that is quite ironic is because of the wave being very like vocally stated, now most valued companies of the world has turned out to be AI companies. Every single person more or less wants to navigate on this wave, and it just is not authentic. So what we don't like is that every CV has AI on it. So I was actually talking to a venture capitalist very recently, and he literally said, look, if there is one founder that is not using the word of AI, I'm going to invest into it. I'm so sick of AI initiatives. It's just becoming too widely used and probably not. So for my biggest suggestion to anyone in this field is, of course, be users and make it as part of your lives and all that. But when you walk into an interview or when you walk into a job, go with an exemplary statement saying, I've done this, or I've spent so many hours on this, I've built this, or I've executed this, right? If there is no case example, interest doesn't mean anything. Everybody is interested in this. And we hear these conversations. Also think about the recruiters that you're talking to, or if you're trying to get into the field, investors looking into your company. If there is no real AI in it, then just don't fake it. It's just a bit too much of a commodity these days. And I think stating it with facts, stating with, and the other thing is making it as simple as the business people would understand, and stating it smartly, right? Like, how is AI helping to do something in a different way? And how have you contributed to that is the tactic that you need to walk into an interview. It's not a generic, I'm so interested, I'm so passionate, get me into this, right? It just doesn't work that way. That would be my golden advice.
Excellent. Okay, so we're going to end the official session now. Thanks so much to all the participants. Thanks to Burcu. It's late in Singapore. Thanks to Christoph.